So throughout my time as a grad student back in Canada, Jamie and I teamed up to focus on questions of wind energy acceptance. And what really excited us was comparing the outcomes seen when looking at community-based versus corporate-led development. And alongside our co-authors, Geraint, it was here where we found really a lack of clarity on what community wind energy is, or often should be in the normative kind of sense of the term. Enter, of course, our focus on these ideas and our paper published actually just this morning in Energy Research and Social Science. What great timing for this. In it, we really focus on case studies of community wind energy and see how community wind is theorized and plays out in practice in local communities. And Jamie has kindly just now posted a link to the paper in the chat. Yeah, our talk today is going to be split into 3 parts. We're going to first go over some of the most popular discourses surrounding community wind energy. Next, I'm going to talk about the study's methodology before turning to the results and the analysis. In this, Jamie's going to take over and finish off the second half of the presentation, so wish us luck in that respect. Finally, Jamie will kind of summarize what we see as some important implications for both policy development, but also for future research by people like ourselves. So as researchers who've studied in the community energy space and the corporate-led community energy space, we've long been aware of the local and the non-local benefits that community wind can bring. And this literature is pretty well established, but what isn't as well established, we don't think, is the association between community wind and local acceptance. There's very few instances of people explicitly exploring the connections between these two ideas. And we think it's almost, the advantages are so obvious and clear to researchers that we often don't drill down too much to look at local acceptance per se. And an example of this may be connected to things like benefits and how there's little differences we find sometimes between financial and non-financial benefits in community wind, and in particular, the kind of ownership structures that surround each of these kind of developments. So whether it's through academic outputs, the media, or even the children's book that we saw on the previous page, community energy and community wind energy in particular really enjoys a pretty good reputation. It's often seen as a pathway to improving the environment, addressing local inequities, and building up community capacity. Though a big part of this narrative rests on 2 assumptions. The first being that rural communities are home to idyllic landscapes. They're full of like-minded people who, have all gotten together to in a quest for the common good. And secondly, there's an assumption that community wind energy is democracy in action, and that local projects are built by and because of the wishes of local communities. However, if we borrow some insights from rural studies, and as well from the general kind of renewable energy literature from people like Walker and Devine-Wright, we see that both of these ideas, that host communities are rosy and close-knit, and that projects are community-driven, may be seen more often in academic discourse and less on the ground in rural communities. So I'm sure many of us here, if not all of us here, are aware of the Walker and Devine-Wright framework from 2008. Unfortunately, not this Walker, but the impactful framework where they describe ideal community wind energy as sitting in the top right of this process and outcome diagram, where the process is open and participatory and the outcomes are local and collective. And many of us here, I think, have interpreted that developments in this upper right really are the most socially acceptable, and the ones in the bottom left are the least socially acceptable. But few have really explored what happens when outcomes are local and collective, but processes really aren't. And likewise, what happens when processes are great, open, participatory, but local outcomes aren't so great. And in this, we find if there's any skepticism about community wind and its delivery of local acceptance, it's because of the underwhelming delivery of these kind of promises. So as social scientists now employing, I think, a variety of methods across a large part of the global north in particular, we now really understand the variety of explanations for local support and opposition, and how this is certainly more nuanced and context specific than 10 and certainly 20 years ago. But through this focus on process and fairness, we see examples of new kinds of environmental injustice as described by Schlossberg. And we can connect these two key ideas, process and outcomes, to procedural and distributive justice, which of course has reference. We can reference the previous Walker and Devine-Wright framework in this. So our research really included two major research objectives. The first being to match the theoretical with the empirical, so the theory behind community wind with what's going on the ground, and the second to set an agenda for future work in community wind. And we did this through three questions, three pretty simple questions. How's community wind energy defined? How do empirical case studies connect to the Walker and Devine-Wright framework? And third, kind of bringing it all together, what do the answers suggest for future research and for social acceptance? And how we did this, so we wanted to best understand how community wind energy was described and how it plays out in local communities. We decided quickly that a case study would be best suited for this kind of task. So across 5 academic databases, we conducted some Boolean searches. Originally resulted in 40,000 articles. Thankfully, after sorting by relevance and reviewing the first 200 in each data set, limiting to papers in social science and community wind, we were left with just 65. After full text reviews, we decided to eliminate 50, and that ended up us finished with a sample of approximately 15 papers using a variety of methodologies, including a large portion, to our surprise, of mixed methods work. So Jamie's going to take over from here and go through the results and interpretations.
Thanks, Chad. Just a quick plug. Right about the time that we were putting the ideas together for this paper, we got wind of the fact that Creamer and colleagues were putting together a similar paper on community wind energy. In fact, there's a number of review articles out on community wind energy over the years. Their approach is very different from ours. They actually interviewed, if you haven't seen the paper, they interviewed Patrick and Patrick Devine-Wright and Gord Walker about their interpretations of how their paper was received. Our approach is to actually dig deeper into the empirical papers and see how community wind energy is defined. And what we found, I thought this would be fairly straightforward. Okay, Chad, will you do this? Go find these papers, and Chad did a lot of the legwork on this, as you probably all know, is the case for a lot of our work. And what we found was that there was a lot of diversity, almost crippling diversity, and some people, there's one quote of giving up on the idea of actually defining what community wind energy is, because defining community, as you know, if you're a geographer, others, social scientists of all ilks, know that defining community is so fraught with difficulties. So there's, as expected, or as we sort of lived in denial of the idea that it was there was this crippling diversity, nevertheless we forged ahead. 12 of the papers stress the importance of understanding, of the 15 papers to stress the importance of understanding community first. And of course, their descriptions of community were, about the difficulties in defining it. 9 of those 15 papers said that community should be flexible, that it should fit the project, and that will tie into our bid to talk about and think about local historical context when we think about community. Perhaps the concepts that got the most traction were this distinction between the community of interest and the community of place, and the community of interest being a community that is much more diffuse, people who are interested in renewable energy or wind energy and may want to invest in a co-op, for example, but live tens, hundreds, thousands of kilometers away from the actual development, the actual facility. And then the community of place, the actual locale, the people who are living close to the turbines. And even that group is variously defined, and it's not simply a community because you plunk a bunch of turbines down and draw a circle around them and say, okay, here's the community. Those who are 2, 5, 8 kilometers away from these turbines. So, reminding that we have to be thinking about the historical context of the communities that intersect with that circle if you draw it. Chad, can you advance the slide, please? So the second question was, how do our cases relate to the Walker and Devine-Wright framework? And in fact, most of the papers, if you include those who talk about procedural and distributive justice, we would say most of the papers, but only 6 of the 15 papers actually directly cite the ideas of process and outcome, that those 2 dimensions that are so well known to most of us, which we found a little bit surprising. That was probably because, I'll speak for myself, when I read Devine-Wright and Walker, I just assumed that they were talking about social acceptance when they wrote about these things. So it was classic projection. I was thinking about social acceptance when that's not exactly what they were writing about. So what we're doing here is, how does that framework actually tie in with social acceptance? And so it may not be that in that context, it may not be surprising that only 6 of the 15 do mention it, but authors like Simcock mention the framework in a big way. And Simcock talks about this continuum of collective to private in terms of community wind energy, saying that projects that have either or both decision process and project outcomes that are local and collective. So this is one of the ideas we tie into in the framework that our reorientation of Walker and Devine-Wright. So next slide. So this is what things look like when we compare, when we take all of the papers Chad located according to strict criteria that you can read in the paper. And you can imagine all the operationalization, assumptions, definitional issues that the author group had to sort of wade through to develop a table like this. But this was the goal. One of the main goals was to look at each paper and read across the rows. So if there are 2 check marks, 1 each for process, the majority of the local, there's majority approval of the local process, that people felt it was fair, participatory, and so on. And they, in the next column, they felt that the outcomes were equitably distributed, or at least they were happy with the outcomes. And we see a check mark for majority local acceptance. We're drawing the conclusion that these the first 2 predict the latter, and indeed in a number of those papers, that's one of the many things they might have tested in their study. But in other studies, they didn't. They do talk about community wind energy, but they don't necessarily measure local acceptance, so we don't have data available on those, or they don't specifically talk about whether or not the community approved of the process or the outcome, so we don't have data for those either. But if in this table, the majority of the cases for which we have data shows a fairly expected pattern of when the majority of the locals felt that the process, the siting process was fair and they approved of it, they approved of the way the outcomes were distributed, that indeed there was majority acceptance, but not in all cases. And we don't have really any of those cases where I think it was I forget the colors in the earlier diagram, the orange and the blue star, where we have high approval of the process but not of the outcomes, and that leading to acceptance, or high approval of the outcomes but not necessarily the process. You know, can you have one without the other and social acceptance? There's not a lot of indication that that's going on in any of these studies, though we don't have enough data to say that for sure. So is there a magic bullet is one of the things that we were talking about yesterday. Next slide, please. So if we take the same papers and plot them on the space created by the Walker and Devine-Wright framework, the main thing I want to point out here is that, as expected, most of the dots, most of the studies that measure these things show up in the upper right quadrant. So that got us thinking about, okay, so how, in terms conceptually, how can we advance our thinking about local acceptance of community wind energy? Let's blow up that quadrant. So moving on to the next slide. And what we found in the papers was, you know, things went wrong when distant authorities, whether that's the proponents or governments, operationalized community from the outside without reference to what's going on locally in the among residents near the turbines. That's when things went horribly wrong. And in fact, community wind energy can have the opposite effect. Of creating a lot of animosity in communities and creating opposition. So for policy, this means paying better attention to locally embedded understandings of community. And in fact, in that sense, you can have community wind with just a small collection of farmers, as in the upper figure here, upper photo, or in a large collection of local investors, potentially, as long as everyone is on common ground about how community is defined and what role they play in the process for developing the turbines. For researchers, we need to make clear how community wind energy is conceptualized and by whom, and this speaks to some of the earlier papers about talking about power and the distribution of power in the siting process. So next slide. So what we did with the framework that Walker and Devine-Wright provided us is blow up that upper quadrant. So that's what you're seeing in our diagram, is a transformation of that quadrant into sort of a three-dimensional space. And this is where having someone who specializes in graphics in your department is really helpful. It's like doing a photo fit of a criminal. Okay, this is what I want, and I just want, you know, put it in a diagram, and yeah, add a mustache, adds you know, darker, the hair is darker. And in this case, I said I really think we need to add the idea of local. and we ended up landing on the idea of scale. So we have this house at the origin, and that's where the turbines are. That's where the negative impacts are. So let's focus on, when we think about community wind energy and who might oppose and prevent a development, those are going to be the people who prevent it. So, and I don't think I'm being terribly controversial in saying that. So let's focus on them. And as we move outwards from the origin, we get to cases where we risk a lower social acceptance. So that's the way to read this this three-dimensional figure. So investment scale goes from local to global, where we could have global cooperative investors, but they have no stake in the local impacts. Where the process arrow, the blue arrow, is exactly the same as the original, where it's from participatory at the local level to very closed. And we transform the outcome dimension into a to focus only on benefits and the distribution of benefits, because this is an emerging concept in the literature that benefits is one of the most important parts of outcomes. So we look at ones that are collective at the origin versus private, and we think about private sort of foreign investors at the moving away from the origin. And surrounding all of this is the local historical context of energy transitions. Is this a community ready for transition? Is their local industry not doing so well, such that they might be poised for moving ahead with community wind energy? Next slide. So what this whole exercise of analyzing these empirical papers on community wind energy has taught us is that, you know, for future research, we might consider exploring these four dimensions, the three arrows plus the green circle in that previous figure. And this is, you know, this is what we did yesterday afternoon in the panel, is sort of went through this thought experiment, or, you know, which one is the most important? Well, they're all important, but we may from time to time have those in various sectors suggesting that one thing is more important than another. Let's provide the empirical proof that in fact they all are important. In fact, that's my personal working hypothesis, is that there is none that will have dramatic explanatory power over the others, although I must say I have favored the participatory process as being this sort of, if there's any magic bullet. But I think I'm wrong in that. Now, longitudinal research, Jeremy and yesterday, and the studies, the community wind neighbors study in the US and Germany, that study, we need to be doing more like that, but we're hoping that in those studies we'll measure process benefits and pay attention to scale and measure social acceptance, so we can get a sense of whether or not some of these things have more explanatory power than others. Whether that's quantitative or qualitative research. And we need to be more transparent about how we're operationalizing things. This is Martin Wolsing telling us, let's be precise about who when we talk about community wind energy. Are we talking about the locals? Or are we talking about community as in the whole state or the whole canton? Those are two very different things. So let's be very precise about how we're defining things. And when we're precise, at least we know what we're dealing with when we're reading such papers. And I think that the next slide is a thank you slide. And thank you.